Mahayana is one of two main existing branches of Buddhism and a term for classification of Buddhist philosophies and practice. The Buddhist tradition of Vajrayana is sometimes classified as a part of Mahayana Buddhism, but some scholars may consider it as a different branch altogether. According to the teachings of Mahayana traditions, Mahayana also refers to the path of the Bodhisattva seeking complete enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, also called Bodhisattvayana, or the Bodhisattva vehicle. A Bodhisattva who has accomplished this goal is called a Samyak Sambuddha, or fully enlightened Buddha. A Samyak Sambuddha can establish the Dharma and lead disciples to enlightenment. Mahayana Buddhists teach that enlightenment can be attained in a single lifetime, and this can be accomplished even by a layperson. The Mahayana tradition is the largest major tradition of Buddhism existing today, with 53.2% of practitioners, compared to 35.8% for Theravada and 5.7% for Vajrayana in 2010. In the course of its history, Mahayana Buddhism spread from India to various other Asian countries such as Bangladesh, China, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Tibet, Bhutan, Malaysia, and Mongolia. Major traditions of Mahayana Buddhism today include Zen, Korean Seon, Chinese Chan, Pure Land, Tiantai, and Nichiren. It may also include the Vajrayana Buddhist traditions of Shingon, Tendai and Tibetan Buddhism, which add esoteric teachings to the Mahayana tradition. Etymology. According to Jan Nattiya, the term Mahayana was originally an honorary synonym for Bodhisattvayana, the vehicle of a bodhisattva seeking Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. The term Mahayana was therefore formed independently at an early date as a synonym for the path and the teachings of the Bodhisattvas, since it was simply an honorary term for Bodhisattvayana. The creation of the term Mahayana and its application to Bodhisattvayana did not represent a significant turning point in the development of a Mahayana tradition. The earliest Mahayana texts often use the term Mahayana as a synonym for Bodhisattvayana, but the term Hinayana is comparatively rare in the earliest sources. The presumed dichotomy between Mahayana and Hinayana can be deceptive, as the two terms were not actually formed in relation to one another in the same era. Among the earliest and most important references to the term Mahayana are those that occur in the Lotus Sutra dating between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. Seishi Karashima has suggested that the term first used in an earlier Gandhari Prakrit version of the Lotus Sutra was not the term Mahayana but the Prakrit word Mahājāna in the sense of Mahajnana. At a later stage when the early Prakrit word was converted into Sanskrit, this Mahājāna, being phonetically ambivalent, was mistakenly converted into Mahayana, possibly because of what may have been a double meaning in the famous parable of the burning house, which talks of three vehicles or carts. History. Origins. The origins of Mahayana are still not completely understood. The earliest Western views of Mahayana assumed that it existed as a separate school in competition with the so-called Hinayana schools. The earliest Mahayana texts often depict strict adherence to the path of a bodhisattva, and engagement in the ascetic ideal of a monastic life in the wilderness, akin to the ideas expressed in the Rhinoceros Sutra. The earliest textual evidence of Mahayana comes from sutras originating around the beginning of the Common Era. Jan Nattiya has noted that in some of the earliest Mahayana texts, such as the Ugraparaksha Sutra, use the term Mahayana. Yet there is no doctrinal difference between Mahayana in this context and the early schools. and that Mahayana referred rather to the rigorous emulation of Gautama Buddha in the path of a bodhisattva seeking to become a fully enlightened Buddha. There is also no evidence that Mahayana ever referred to a separate formal school or sect of Buddhism, but rather that it existed as a certain set of ideals and later doctrines for bodhisattvas. Paul Williams has also noted that the Mahayana never had nor ever attempted to have a separate Vinaya or ordination lineage from the early schools of Buddhism, and therefore each bhikkhu or bhikkhuni adhering to the Mahayana formally belonged to an early school. Membership in these nikayas, or monastic sects, continues today with the Dharmaguptaka Nikaya in East Asia, and the Mulasarvastivada Nikaya in Tibetan Buddhism. Therefore Mahayana was never a separate rival sect of the early schools. Paul Harrison clarifies that while monastic Mahayanists belonged to a Nikaya, not all members of a Nikaya were Mahayanists. From Chinese monks visiting India, we now know that both Mahayana and non-Mahayana monks in India often lived in the same monasteries side by side. The Chinese monk Yijing, who visited India in the 7th century CE, distinguishes Mahayana from Hinayana as follows. Both adopt one and the same Vinaya, and they have in common the prohibitions of the 5 offences, and also the practice of the 4 noble truths. Those who venerate the Bodhisattvas and read the Mahayana Sutras are called the Mahayanists, while those who do not perform these are called the Hinayanists. Much of the early extant evidence for the origins of Mahayana comes from early Chinese translations of Mahayana texts. These Mahayana teachings were first propagated into China by Lokaksma, the first translator of Mahayana Sutras into Chinese during the 2nd century CE. Earliest Mahayana Sutras. Several scholars have suggested that the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which are among the earliest Mahayana Sutras, developed among the Mahasamphakara along the KraSna river in the Andhra region of southern India. The earliest Mahayana Sutras to include the very first versions of the Prajnaparamita genre, along with texts concerning Aksvya Buddha, which were probably written down in the 1st century BCE in the south of India. Guangxing states, several scholars have suggested that the Prajnaparamita probably developed among the Mahasamgikas in southern India, in the Andhra country, on the KraSna river. A.K. Warder believes that the Mahayana originated in the south of India and almost certainly in the Andhra country. Anthony Barber and Sree Padma note that historians of Buddhist thought have been aware for quite some time that such pivotally important Mahayana Buddhist thinkers as Nagarjuna, Dignaga, Candrakirti, Aryadeva, and Bhavaviveka, among many others, formulated their theories while living in Buddhist communities in Andhra. They note that the ancient Buddhist sites in the lower KraSna valley, including Amaravati, Nagarjunakonda and Jagayapata, can be traced to at least the 3rd century BCE, if not earlier. Akira Hirakawa notes that evidence suggests that many early Mahayana scriptures originated in South India. Some scholars think that the earliest Mahayana sutras were mainly composed in the south of India, and later the activity of writing additional scriptures was continued in the north. However, the assumption that the presence of an evolving body of Mahayana scriptures implies the contemporaneous existence of distinct religious movement, called Mahayana, may be a serious misstep. Some scholars further speculate that the Prajnaparamita Sutras were written in response to the ultra-realism of Abhidharma. Some early Mahayana Sutras were translated by the Kusana monk Lokaksma, who came to China from the kingdom of Gandhara. His first translations to Chinese were made in the Chinese capital of Luoyang between 178 and 189 CE. Some Mahayana Sutras translated during the 2nd century CE include the following. Astasahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra, Vimalakirti Nirdesa Sutra, Larja Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, Aksobhyatathagata Vyuha Sutra, Ugra Parupcha Sutra, Manjasri Parupcha Sutra, Drumakanera Parupcha Sutra, Urangama Samadhi Sutra, Bhadrapala Sutra, Ajatasatru Kauktyuvinodana Sutra, Kasyapa Sutra, Lokanuvartana Sutra, an early sutra connected to the Avatamsaka Sutra. This corpus of texts often emphasizes ascetic practices and forest dwelling, absorbed in states of meditative concentration. Harrison points to the enthusiasm in the Lokaksma Sutra corpus for the extra ascetic practices, for dwelling in the forest, and above all for states of meditative absorption. Meditation and meditative states seem to have occupied a central place in early Mahayana, certainly because of their spiritual efficacy, but also because they may have given access to fresh revelations and inspiration. Earliest inscriptions. The earliest stone inscription containing a recognizably Mahayana formulation and a mention of the Buddha Amitabha was found in the Indian subcontinent in Mathura, dated to around 180 CE. Remains of a statue of a Buddha bear the Brahma inscription, made in the year 28 of the reign of King Haviska. For the Blessed One, the Buddha Amitabha, there is also some evidence that Emperor Haviska himself was a follower of Mahayana Buddhism, and a Sanskrit manuscript fragment in the Skoyen collection describes Haviska as having set forth in the Mahayana evidence of the name Mahayana. In Indian inscriptions in the period before the 5th century is very limited in comparison to the multiplicity of Mahayana writings transmitted from Central Asia to China at that time. Early Mahayana Buddhism. During the period of early Mahayana Buddhism, 4 major types of thought developed: Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Buddha nature, and Buddhist logic as the last and most recent. In India, the 2 main philosophical schools of the Mahayana were the Madhyamaka and the later Yogacara. During the Kushan Empire, Mahayana Buddhism teachings encouraged societies to give generous donations to the Buddhist monasteries, which gave the people religious merits. Earlier stage forms of Mahayana, such as the doctrines of Prajnaparamita, Yogacara, Buddha nature, and the Pure Land teachings, are still popular in East Asia. In some cases these have spawned new developments, while in others they are treated in the more traditional syncretic manner. Paul Williams has noted that in this tradition in the Far East, primacy has always been given to study of the sutras. Late Mahayana Buddhism. Various classes of Vajrayana literature developed as a result of royal courts sponsoring both Buddhism and Saivism. The Manjushri Mulakalpa, which later came to classified under Kriya Tantra, states that mantras taught in the Saiva, Garuda and Vaishnava Tantras will be effective if applied by Buddhists, since they were all taught originally by Manjushra. The Gurya-Siddhi of Padmavajra, a work associated with the Gurya Samaja tradition, prescribes acting as a Saiva guru and initiating members into Saiva Siddhanta scriptures and mandalas. The Samvara Tantra texts adopted the Pitha list from the Saiva text Tantrasadvava, introducing a copying error where a deity was mistaken for a place.